Today on this episode of The Brain Surgeon's Take, we will be discussing what makes a criminal with Professor and Chair of Sociology, Criminology at the University of Miami, Dr. Alex Piquero. Understand the complicated mind of a criminal, what motivates them, why did they become deviant, when do they manifest their actions, and how can we correct their delinquency. Much more on this podcast episode. Welcome back, everyone. Here's my take on Dr. Alex Piquero. He understands the mind of a criminal as well as anyone on the planet. As a nationally recognized leader in criminology and sociology with nearly 3 decades of experience in the field, Dr. Piquero has seen it all. Now, as professor and chair at the University of Miami, he is imparting his wisdom on the next generation of experts on the topic. The subject of this podcast intrigued me. We have all used the word and know what it means, but rarely, if ever, have we really thought about how or why people become criminals. The scariest part of this interview was actually realizing how common criminality is in our society, with trends only showing an increase over time. The human mind is the most complex entity we have ever seen. Imagine trying to understand why it becomes delinquent at times. Deep, to say the least. Listen up as we discuss what makes a criminal. Check it out. Hey, Alex, how are you?
Good morning. Pleasure to be here.
Listen, man, great to have you on the podcast to talk about such an interesting topic of what makes a criminal. You've made your career off of criminology and sociology and are a true world expert on this. So I'm curious to see your insights.
Yeah, I happened into this career, actually, to be quite honest with you. I was actually a radio, television, and film major. And in the second semester of my freshman year, one of my classes didn't make. And so back then we had to wait and drop ed, wait in line. You get to the queue and you see what was available. And it was only an introduction to criminal justice class. So I said, great. I signed up, and the teacher and the topic totally changed my life trajectory. And 30 some odd years later, I'm happy to be doing it.
Well, there's, things happen for a reason. That's clearly just a sign that this was meant to be your career.
Yep.
Let's talk about definitions. I think we use the term often, but maybe don't know what it exactly means. What is the definition of a criminal?
So look, I mean, we have to separate the person from the act, right? And so that's one of the most important things. You're a doctor, I'm a professor. You perform work, I perform work. It doesn't define us per se. It's just one role we have. So a person who's an offender or a criminal simply broke a legal statute. So there's the act of the offense and then the person behind the act of the offense. So basically, it's a legal violation of a legal statute.
And I guess the big question that people talk about, nature versus nurture, probably a mix, but as an expert, wanted to get your opinion on that.
Yeah, that's always the hard part. People are born into this world with a series of different characteristics and traits, but they're also born into environments. Those environments are family environments, they're school environments, they're neighborhood environments, and there's also the context in which we find ourselves living, at that particular epoch in era. And so, it's always hard to say it's this or that. It's certainly some sort of combination, but the key, I think, is understanding the conditions under which certain people act based upon what they bring to the table and the circumstances they find themselves in.
Now, what about people use the term "you're born violent"? Is there a genetic predisposition to violence or performing criminal acts?
Categorically false. There are people, there's assumptions about human nature, right? Some people believe that people are born evil but have to be taught good. Some people believe that, people are born good and bad society screws it up. And then there are also people who believe that people are blank slates. If people are born criminal, no one has ever found that kind of gene per se. We do know that people have some biological and psychological conditions that may be elevated for risk, but we have to worry about the false positive, false negative issue, right? Many more people have certain characteristics and traits that might lead them to certain forms of behavior, but many of those people who have those same characteristics don't. And that's why that, combination of traits and environment are what the genesis of most behavior is, not just actually aggressive behavior.
Now, what about red flags? People frequently cite the most common one is cruelty to animals. kids that are cruel to animals have a much higher rate of becoming criminals. Are there what other red flags have you heard of or seen?
Yeah, I don't know if I would call them red flags per se as much as I would call them risk factors. And it's the totality of those risk factors that when you accumulate them lead to a higher probability of committing a particular act. And that's the whole thing. It's these are probabilistic, not deterministic. So, you correctly identified, cruelty to animals. That's certainly one of those. A real big predictor of aggressive behavior is poor impulse control. In fact, that may be one of the strongest that we know. And it's not just that affects the likelihood of criminal behavior, it affects lots of different life outcomes like educational attainment, employment attainment, social skills development, relationship status, and relationship quality. Other ones are literally growing up in a disadvantaged environment. And that could be a disadvantaged home environment or a disadvantaged environment in terms of the neighborhood someone lives in. But again, these things exacerbate the risk. And so when you add up those risk factors, the way I think about it is, a kid who has several of these risk factors goes to the plate with an 0-1 count, not an 0-0 count when they're facing a pitcher. So I think that that's the way we need to think about risk. But it's also important, doctor, to think about protective factors. People might have risk factors for lots of kinds of health diseases, right? But there are things that an individual can do to stymie those risk factors from accelerating. And we know some of those protective factors are strong family environments, good educational quality, being taught impulse control, resiliency away from delinquent peers. All of those kinds of things are that protective factors mitigate the risk factors, and that kind of balances what we look for when we're thinking about the likelihood of individuals at risk for criminal activity.
So you talk about environment. I want to delve into it a little bit more. How does social learning play a role in criminal behavior? Observation, role models, that type of social learning.
It's a key input, and social learning is a key input not just for learning criminal behavior. It's also a key input for learning other kinds of behavior, such as learning how to hit a baseball or tying one's tie. You learn from modeling someone else doing that act, and that's a real big theory in criminology that kind of grew out of operant and classical conditioning and psychology, where people are exposed to different kinds of people and different kinds of attitudes. And the more people are exposed to not only pro criminal or pro deviant attitudes, is that they see the behaviors rewarded. And that's that, punishment versus reward competition that we are constantly being influxed by things around us. So we see people be rewarded for crime, and that people learn from that. And people also learn from punishment. And the way I think about it is, I have a 5-year-old dog, and who randomly barks probably in the next 5 minutes, who knows? But dogs are sensitive to rewards and punishments, and the same thing is true with human behavior and human beings when they're born. So the more we can expose people to non-criminal behaviors and attitudes, the better off we'll be down the road.
Is there a most influential environmental factor that's been identified?
Not like not where like playing the Family Feud and the top five answers on the board, and number one is easily the number one. I think it's several of those. Think about distressed environments in any major city, right? So in Miami, I grew up in the Washington D.C. area, Baltimore. All of the cities that we know about have a real low income distressed environment, and in those environments, there's poor access to housing, poor access to healthcare, poor access to food options, disadvantaged schools. All of those things pile on. And it's not one of those things per se, it's the totality of those environmental circumstances. We also know that many kids who grow up in certain environments, they see trash on the street. They see disorder. They see disorganization. There's no community type of control in those environments. And then they go to school and they don't have adequate books or adequate ability to access the internet. It's all of those things, so that the resource level is not what those kids need in order to be successful adults, not only in terms of educational attainment but also in the workforce in today's day and age.
So give us an example. So you talk about social strain. Give us a real example of how social strain leads to criminal behavior in the future. What type of interactions and dynamics are there?
Yeah, so what happens, and let's take a kid who grows up in a real rich part of town and a kid who grows up in a real poor part of town. So, they're going to have already exposure to different kinds of things around them. And the kid who grows up in a really disadvantaged environment doesn't mean that they have the ability to get out of those environments. It means that the risk is now starting to accumulate. And that risk accumulates and they start to have fewer opportunities, and some opportunities get knifed off. And so when kids don't have, for example, adequate schooling or attainment in education, that starts knifing off opportunities for gain, not just employment, right? It's gainful employment. So kids start failing. And when the kid starts failing, it's like, growing up in the Northeast, and when you're making a snowman or snow person, you start with a little snowball and you're adding more and more snow to create the base. And that's the kind of way we think about social strain and social disorganization. It's the accumulation of risk, and those risks then create knifed opportunities. And therefore, by knifing off like pro-social opportunities, then kids are faced only with potential antisocial opportunities to gain the kinds of things that they need to succeed, i.e., money, status, wealth, and so on.
What about parenting styles? Obviously controversial, obviously critical. Has the research shown that particular parenting styles are either good or bad?
Yeah, so that's a great point, and that's one of the things that's really interesting about criminology is that we're drawing in input from public health, from psychology, from sociology to understand the genesis of criminal activity, why people offend in the circumstances they do, and then why they don't. There are different kind of styles of parenting, right? Dismissive parenting doesn't work. Strict authoritarian parenting probably a little too much. So there's a happy medium of how you teach and punish children for their behavior, but it has to be corrective. It can't be punitive. But one of the most important things we know from criminology and my work as well, doing meta analysis on these topics, is that early family parent training programs, like the very famous David Old's Nurse Home Family Partnership Program, it is absolutely the number one thing we can do to set kids off in the right frame of mind, in the right space. Those first 5 years are absolutely critical, where parents are delivering socialization, pro-social socialization to those kids. And they do it in a way where the kid learns positively and not punitively. So sometimes people have to be strict, but overly strict is too much and overly lenient is too much. So that happy medium is, right there. And there are lots of really strong evidence-informed, evidence-based parenting programs that we know work for creating socialization that teaches kids impulse control, teaches kids how to do anger management, teaches kids to think about the long-term consequences of their actions. But parents need to be taught that. And that's a really important thing. And there's no book on the shelf that says, this is how you teach your kid impulse control, right? So a lot of these programs exist all over the country and all over the world. The key is ensuring that parents have access to those, that they're resourced, and that they're staffed. And it's easy to talk about those things, but much less easier to see those things staffed and resourced at levels that they need to be.
Now, you had mentioned that there's no gene identified for being violent, and I also agree with that. But what about genetic inheritance playing a role in behavior? Meaning, if your father or your mother has been in the penitentiary, are you more likely to be in the penitentiary? And is that really genetics, or is that just you're born into an environment that's propagated?
Yeah, so it's more of the latter. Look, I mean, there has been, because the technology is getting better, there has been much more work on understanding the impact of genes on various kinds of behaviors, and not just criminal behaviors, but also risk for certain kinds of health outcomes later in life. But we do know that a risk factor is having a parent incarcerated. But plenty of kids have parents who are incarcerated who never become offenders, right? And plenty of kids never have a parent become, incarcerated and they become offenders, right? So there's that true positive, false positive, true negative, false negative thing that we always have to think about. But we do know that parental incarceration is a risk factor. But what that does, doctor, is it removes a parental figure from the home. So it removes two sets of eyes, it removes socialization, it removes that kind of positive parenting, and it also removes income. So it's the byproduct of that is, I think, where the risk is materialized for a child. But the accumulation of that, parent incarcerated, kid doesn't have access to adequate schooling, kid lives in a distressed environment, kid lives in poverty. dun, 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 you're adding all of those risks up.
Yeah, it's like anything else. You want to have all the good in your favor, but you're probably not going to have all the good in your favor, but at least minimize the bad. And I feel like in those situations, the risk factors just add up. It doesn't guarantee a criminal. It just makes it more likely. You had mentioned about technologies and how we are understanding more about the neurotransmitters. What do we
Mhm.
know about the brain, the hormones, neurotransmitters, and how they affect a person's behavior, particularly criminal behavior?
Yeah, that's great. There's a lot of literature on dopamine and serotonin and its effect on behavior and how people have to regulate that. And of course, there's medicines for that kind of regulation. And there was a lot of discussion about ADHD and impulsivity. And then we gave kids a lot of drugs to calm their ADHD down. And does that play a role? Yeah, it plays a role. But remember, that's either magnified or minimized in a context. And I think that that's the really important thing to look at. I was part of the MacArthur Foundation, a research network on adolescent development and juvenile justice that was in the 1990s and into the 2000s. At that time, there had been still little research on brain development and how kids start to form the cognitive components of their brain, right? The reward structure versus the punishment structure. And we found through research our network did, as well as many others, that the kids' reward structures develop sooner than their impulse control structures. So at 14, the reward structure of the brain is firing on all cylinders. Everybody remembers what it's like to be 14 and 15 years old. But then, the self-control part isn't really developed into the late 20s, mid 20s. And we started to learn that not only from observational work, but also brain scan technology. And of course, look, I mean, everybody loves the brain scan lighting up and so forth and so on. But that's a tool, and it gives us an idea of what to look forward. But it's not deterministic. But that technology has started to shape the way we understand behavior. But we also, doctor, have to understand it's people acting in context. Right. One of the things we did in some research, we did it with respect to how alcohol influences self control. We know that alcohol can diminish the effect of self control such that it kind of people lose the ability to think cognitively and think very straight. They lose the ability to think about the long-term consequences of their actions. So we know that there's that interaction between substances, decision making, and context. We know that people may act in some ways under those kinds of conditions when people are around or when people aren't around. And we're only starting to now get to that point because we have the tools and the technology. We did in the lab, and the lab is great, but now translating that into the real world, we can't do a lot of research in real world decision making. I mean, some of the work I did, interviewing active offenders in Philadelphia, we couldn't observe them like when they're walking on the street, obviously, but we gave them pictures of houses and said, we know which of these are more attractable targets, compared to other ones. And other work that people have done with drug sellers, asking them, what cues are you looking for to avoid detection? So there's that kind of work that's happening in criminology. It's very exciting because, we're trying to understand why people do what they do in the circumstances they find themselves in. Now, remember, some people also select the circumstances they find themselves in. So we have that causation versus selection issue that's always looming in the background, but that's true of any social science, of course.
And you mentioned technology, which is obviously here to stay. You're not gonna halt progress. But let's talk about how technology, I feel, has impacted the youth in particular and increased mental illness and potentially criminality. How do you see smartphones, internet, and social media impacting criminal behavior in this country?
Yeah, it reminds me a lot of the discussion about heavy metal lyrics when I was growing up in the 1980s, right? And are these songs making people commit suicide? And it was a very similar discussion 40 years ago that we're having now. These smartphones are a tool, and tools are good, but tools also can be misused and can have adverse outcomes. Plenty of people are on social media and aren't influenced, but plenty of people are influenceable. And I think this is an important role for parents to educate. We're not going to eliminate kids on social media. This is not going to happen. The ship has sailed. But how do we help them understand the images that they're seeing online and how they should interpret those images? Or when they listen to songs, lyrics that say certain things, whether they're negative or they're evil, or they're promoting one thing or the other. I think this is where ensuring that we're educating kids, and that's not just a parent's job, right? It's the school's job. It's everybody's job to do what we can to educate kids about the use and misuse of all forms of technology. Look, the internet, the social media sites, people can go down rabbit holes. And the key is ensuring when you use the technology that you have the skill set in you to understand and recognize when you need to pull back and say, you know what, I'm just not going to look at this stuff anymore. I'm going to go read a book or go for a walk or go to the gym or do whatever those things are. So that's always, the risk we always have with a tool or a new technology. And as you know, doctor, the technology outpaces the regulation. And
Always.
that's a really important part is, how do we harness the power of these tools in a positive way and not succumb to the negativity that can arise.
Now, you, as someone who has more experience in this field than anyone else, is there anything we can assume about human beings and their decision making patterns, or is everyone truly 100% unique and different?
No, I look. I mean, it's we're all unique people. I mean, that by definition, we all have genetic traits that are different from everybody else. But I think that we can think about general forms of risk, general forms of protection, and people are going to more or less likely operate in the same kind of way. One of the things I've always been interested in is decision making across context. Situations matter, environments matter, and what people bring to the table is influenced by that environment. And people might act one way in one environment, another way in another environment. There's one really interesting study many, many years ago about one of my psychologist friends did when he was doing a brain scan test, and he had kids in a driving simulator. And some kids were driving in the simulator alone, and other kids would bring one of their friends into the simulator with them. Well, which kid do you think drove faster? Well, the kid with the friend drove faster than the kid who was by himself. And so that's really interesting, right? Because that shows that people are influenced by other people around them. And that and that's a really interesting, fascinating part of this. But we also know that self-control is, for example, a replicable risk factor. People who have impulse control problems are more likely to become aggressive. They're more likely to fail in school. That's a common risk factor. And I think what we try to do in criminology and the social sciences is what is the kind of things that affect most people, right? Because when we're developing intervention programs or prevention programs, you can't just tailor for one person, right? You have to create programs that will affect as many people as possible. Very much like in the medical world, as you know, but more than I, when you create a medicine, you want it to affect as many people as possible, right? We saw that with the COVID vaccine. You try to create something that's translatable for most human beings. And that's what we try to do as well in criminology is we know some things operate the same way for a lot of people. We know some things are not as important for some people as other things are. And the key is isolating that and then scaling that up from a prevention point of view and an intervention point of view.
They say that it's nearly impossible to change adult behavior. Once you're 20, 25, you're kind of set in your ways and the way that you view the world, the way you approach the world. Uh, Is this true with criminality? I mean, changing adult behavior once it's established.
No, I think that there are plenty of success stories even among people who offend in adulthood. And so, is it harder to change people? I think it's harder to learn more undoing 25 years of thinking and 25 years of acting, just like it is, giving up alcohol or especially smoking in adulthood when you've done it for 40 years, right? The body's used to something. I think for offenders, it's more about reorienting their self control, reorienting their decision making patterns, their cognitive abilities. We know cognitive behavioral therapy is just as effective for adults as it is for juveniles. So I'm not willing to turn away from that. And in fact, when you actually some research we actually published some years ago actually shows that people think that survey of adults that people in adulthood can still change. We have that positive outlook. There are lots of success stories. There are failures too, but there is the success that happens when people are rehabilitated. And so we have to look at, okay, what was successful about, why did they turn the corner? What did they participate in? What was available to them when they were incarcerated? What did they take stock of? How did they use that in terms of reentry back into society? So I'm certainly, and that's not a bleeding liberal point of view. That's what the evidence actually shows, that people can change.
And on that same topic, how does our jail system, our prison system do in terms of rehabilitating? Pros and cons, things you would change about our current model.
Yeah, there's a big distinction, of course, between jail and prison. I mean, jail is reserved for people who have sentences of a year or less. Prison is reserved for people who have sentences of longer than a year. What we have found is that recidivism is a really hard thing to knock away. We know that 3-year recidivism patterns for state prisoners is around 60%. That's pretty high. And if you follow those people out, it gets higher and higher and higher. So we know that there are forces that are headwinds into that plane going westbound, that it's making it hard for those people to move away from their prior activity in terms of offending. What we do know is that those facilities that have the evidence-based programs that then have the staff to carry them out, and that the individuals then use. So there's a lot of ifs there. And not every prison has programming or the kinds of programming that work, and or the staff to do that. We also know from samples that we've done among offenders, they want programming. It's not like they don't want the programming; they want it. And look, it's great for all of us if we can give them this kind of programming, so that when they come out, they're successful. And we do know that there are things that work in facilities. The idea of reentry, when individuals are going to come out 5 years from now or 10 years from now, the idea of reentry and programming starts day one when that person's incarcerated. So what can we do as a correctional facility, or as a state who is invested in this? What can we do for that? One of my dad used to change oil in our car. Grew up very modestly, and my dad used to use Fram oil filters. And Fram had this great thing. The slogan says, "You can pay me now, or you can pay me later." And I've always thought about that phrase in criminology. I can put the money in now and do that early life prevention or that really good intervention in incarcerated facilities, or I'm just going to be paying more consequences later on down the road. So the key, of course, doctor, is ensuring that the facilities have the programming that works, and that they have the staff who know how to carry out. Because fidelity, as you know very well in your own work, is
Mhm.
just as important as the idea. So if we're not carrying out the program the way it's intended to carry out, then we're just going to fail. But one thing is very clear, and our research in Florida shows us, that providing educational opportunities for individuals while they're incarcerated and having them attain that while they are in facilities is a really important thing for when a lot of them get out. And it's absolutely critical. It works for men, it works for women, and it works for all minorities and majority racial and ethnic populations. So you can talk about earlier in the conversation, what's the one thing? Education. Absolutely critical. And it's not just the academic-y, high school or an AA degree or a bachelor's degree. It's other kinds of educational services, skill delivery. We need people in the skill industry. I mean, we need those kinds of things to occur. So the more opportunities that we can give individuals while they're incarcerated, the better for them, and better for you, and the better for me, and the better for our neighborhood.
Yeah, I think we definitely have some work to do in terms of our prison system, like you said. And I think you invest early and there's a huge return on that investment, is what basically you're saying. And I totally agree. Now, you were appointed by President Biden to serve as director of the Bureau of Justice Stats. How do we currently measure crime and justice in America? And what are the biggest challenges that we're currently facing?
Yeah, so it was a huge honor of a lifetime to serve the president of the United States and to lead one of the nation's 13 statistical agencies. Never thought the 14-year-old Alex would ever be involved in that area. So Crime and justice data, in my mind, should be treated just as public health data is. It's critical to the knowledge, and it's critical to understanding not just patterns, but using that data to inform policy and guide decision making, whether it's the local, state, or the national level. The challenges we have in the nation right now, and I'll start with police data or arrest data that everybody's very familiar with when people look at crime rates and crime trends, is the data are voluntary. So the FBI releases their crime data on arrests and incidents of crime, but it's based on voluntary data collection from the 18,000 some odd law enforcement agencies. So that's a problem. So we have a picture of crime in America. It's an incomplete picture of crime. The Bureau of Justice Statistics that I led also has what's called the National Crime Victimization Survey, which is a survey of over 200,000 individuals from 100,000 households that asks them about their victimization experiences. But more importantly, it also asks if they reported that victimization experience to law enforcement or to someone else. In fact, a report I just released 2 weeks ago showed that domestic violence is one of the most underreported crimes in America. So whatever the FBI estimate is of arrest of domestic violence, we know it's a floor. Our research actually shows that it's somewhere between 20 and 70% higher than what that is. People choose not to report domestic violence for lots of reasons. Some fear retaliation, some don't have the services that they're available, whatever those reasons are. So the more we can get people to report, the better off we will be. So that's some of the challenges we have. Data collection is very expensive. That National Crime Victimization Survey, for example, was about half of my operating budget when I was the director of Bureau of Justice Statistics. It's millions of dollars, but encouraging the government and encouraging people that we need to treat crime data on par with public health data and medical data, and in a real time manner. The FBI releases their crime data in the fall for the previous year. So the data that just came out from the FBI last month was for calendar year 23. That's 9 months lag is not immediately helpful, right? We need real time data, and private industry, nonprofits have started to create real time crime trackers. So we need that information. The way I describe it is, like I can look on FlightAware right now and see where every plane is in America, where it took off, where it's landing, what its altitude is. Everybody has used these trackers to find out what the planes that they have to go pick up on. We need that for crime data in America. And so we need to have the federal government say this is a priority, and it's just as important as labor stats, as the census, as public health data. Until we get to that point, we're going to be lagging.
And so that kind of leads me to my final question. As someone, again, who's seen it all, where do you see this field of criminal justice going in the next 5, 10, 15 years? Any major breakthroughs, super exciting areas of development?
Yeah, I think on three different levels. I mean, we're constantly learning more about human behavior, and the tools of that. What we've gotten with the imaging studies, we've gotten with the genetic stuff. That's where a lot of the new action will go, in terms of understanding how people, what do they come to the table with, and how are those risks exacerbated. So I think that's one good development. Another one is all of the new methodological and statistical advances have helped us now see things that we couldn't see before. Now, those are tools. And as I tell all my students in the class, tools are in a toolbox, but the research question always guides which tool to use. But the advances in technology, we're starting to use that in our own discipline, as is psychology, and GIS with the mapping software that has come around in the last 30 years. We're now able to see things visually that we couldn't see before. Those are descriptive tools, right? So now you understand the picture. Now you have to go into, those lines in an Excel file. Those are all people, and understanding, what the risk and protective factors are. And lastly, I think for me, we're learning a lot about what works in prevention and intervention. One of the things that I published some years ago with an economist at Vanderbilt, Mark Cohen, we found that if you can save a kid from a high risk life of crime, we're saving $5 million. And so when you think about that, because legislatures and policymakers, money is how decisions get made, for right or wrong. And that if we can scale up the things that we know work in the first 5 years of life, it's not going to just lead to better outcomes for those kids in terms of lower crime, but it also leads to lower outcomes on other adverse activities. So for me, criminology, like any social science discipline, is an integration of what we're learning from different fields. I encourage my undergrad and grad students to go to public health, to go to medicine, to go to geography, to go to political science, to learn how those disciplines approach human behavior. And I think the more we can expand out of our usual silos, this game, the better off all of us will be as not just academics and researchers, but as we're trying to improve the human condition. I mean, that's your goal, that's my goal, that's what all of our goals should be. So I'm always excited about that, and it's always great seeing. I was just set up a meeting in Washington D.C. with my former agency. Our College of Arts and Sciences took about 30 undergrad students to DC to meet at the State Department, to meet at the CIA, to go to the Federal Reserve, and I had them go to the DOJ. And they met different agencies, and they came away going, I had no idea about the criminal justice system. I thought it was just punishing. Right now, they learn about rehabilitation, they learn about prevention, and that to me is the exciting part of being in the academy. Right, and our job being around students is always so rewarding because they're learning something. And of course, our job isn't to change their mind. Our job is to challenge them and to get them to think about, oh, I didn't realize that. When you see that light on in the classroom, when you see that light on walking, from building to building, and then they get excited about the topic. It reminds me 30 some odd years ago about what changed my life trajectory. And it was the learning something that just got my passion sparked for a topic. And that's what makes criminology so exciting to me.
Alex, what a terrific interview. Kudos number one to you for all the work you've done during your career and also your team studying something, getting the science, getting the data, and understanding this disease. Because I think most people just throw criminals into a general bucket. Oh, they're a criminal and they can't be changed. They don't want to understand why someone does something. The fact that your team is helping us understand this condition, so to speak, so that we can prevent it and make the world a better place. It just couldn't be more inspirational, all the work that you and your team are doing.
Thanks, Doctor. It says, teamwork makes the dream work.
Always, my friend. All right. Have a great weekend. Really appreciate your time.
Thank you so much. This was great. Appreciate it.
Take care.